Hey folks, after my coverage on Matej Periš and then Odin Jakobsen, quite a few people got in touch asking me to cover Matej Periš, as many felt that the incident was similar. On the night of the 30th of December 2021, Matej travelled to Belgrade, the capital city of Serbia, with 6 of his closest friends for a New Year's Eve break. Belgrade is a city of around 1.7 million people, and by all accounts, this should have been a straightforward few days away with a group of lads in a foreign city, celebrating the New Year's together. But somewhere in the early hours of the following morning, things would go very wrong. Matej, who was 27 at the time, would somehow end up running out of an upmarket nightclub in only a t-shirt and sneakers, sprinting along the Sava waterfront in near freezing temperatures before simply disappearing into the night. His disappearance sparked one of the largest cross-border searches the region has seen in quite some time, with Serbian and Croatian authorities both involved, and lasting 139 days before his body would finally be recovered. To this day, the precise reason he ran out of the club in such a panic has never been fully explained, and some parts of the conclusions drawn have been contested in the months and years that followed. Matej was born in 1994 in Split on Croatia's Dalmatian coast. He came from a well-known and respected family in the area. His father, Matej Periš, was an international water polo referee, which is a sport that holds enormous cultural significance in that part of the country. As you'd probably expect of someone with that kind of upbringing, Matej had himself played water polo in his youth, and grew up quite an athletic, strong swimmer. He stood at around 188 centimetres tall, or around 6'2", with light hair and blue eyes. And from everything I've read about him, he was someone that was incredibly well liked by everyone that knew him. He had 2 sisters and lived in Split with his mother, Jenny, his grandmother and his grandfather. He had studied economics, but had ended up working as a skipper at a nautical club in Split, where over the summers he would take tourists out on yacht cruises along the Adriatic coast. By all accounts, he was good at it and made a decent living that way. He had a long-term girlfriend back home named Sanya, and by all accounts had a very promising future ahead of him. It is worth mentioning here that around 3 months before his own disappearance, on the 29th of September 2021, Matej had experienced a really significant loss in his life. His closest friend, Ivor Olunic, had passed away as a result of a motorcycle accident. The 2 of them had actually been riding out together that day, returning home from Makarska, and as it's been described, Ivor had accelerated to try and catch up to and overtake a car driven by another friend. He entered a curve too sharply, hit an embankment, lost his helmet in the process, and suffered a head injury. So this wasn't just something Matej witnessed from a distance, this was his best friend right in front of him while they were riding together. It was something that must have very obviously weighed heavily on him in the weeks that followed, to the point that he even sold his own motorcycles afterwards. I bring this up because it forms a small part of the broader picture of what was going on in his life leading up to this incident. The trip to Belgrade itself had been planned several months in advance. The plan was for the group to drive to Zagreb first, leave their cars there, and from there to rent a van for the long onward journey into East Serbia. They arrived in Belgrade on the afternoon of the 30th and had already organised a rental apartment in Dorchol, which is a central and trendy nightlife district situated on the Belgrade side of the Danube. They planned to spend several days in the city, culminating in the New Year's Eve celebrations. They got to the apartment at around 6 PM and almost immediately began drinking. At 9 PM, the group went for dinner that evening at the Amber restaurant, which is located in Beitin Hala, or Concrete Hall, a fashionable strip of restaurants and clubs running along the right bank of the Sava River, below the Kalemegdan fortress. They continued drinking through dinner, and around midnight, they moved on from the restaurant to the Gotik nightclub, which is also situated within Beitin Hala. According to the club's manager, the group entered without a reservation and were seated in a booth. Over the course of the night, they would go on to order what was described as 4 bottles of whiskey and 6 bottles of wine between them, which is obviously a significant amount for 7 people. There was also a live performance going on at the club that night by Serbian singer Slobodan Velkovic, better known as Kobe. The manager has stated publicly that there were no incidents whatsoever during their time there, and the police have also stated that Matej and his friends were not involved in any conflict either inside the club or outside of it. I should mention though, that there is a competing witness account that has circulated in the Serbian press, in which a person who was also in the club that night claimed that there was actually a brief row in the back of the club between Matej's group and a separate group from Zadar. According to that witness, the club security got involved and escorted 2 young men out, but the whole thing was over in less than 5 minutes. The club's owner, Srećko Širović, and the police have both denied that anything like that occurred, so make of that what you will. According to one of his friends, Matej's phone was at around 75% charge at 11 PM. The club apparently had no Wi-Fi, and Matej reportedly switched his phone off at some point during the night. The last message he had sent to Sanja was a video at around 9:30 PM, and after that point his phone seems to have gone offline. Sometime between 1:20 AM and 1:40 AM on what was now the 31st of December, Matej told his friends that he was going to the toilet, or alternatively to get some air. The precise wording isn't really clear. He left the booth and would never return to it. Crucially, when he left the table, he did not take his jacket with him. His jacket had been left in the club's cloakroom, which to most people at the time strongly suggested that he intended to come back. He was dressed in just a black t-shirt, dark trousers and white-soled sneakers. The next portion of the night has been reconstructed in great detail by the Serbian Ministry of Internal Affairs, who reportedly went through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage from the various cameras dotted around the Beitin Hala area and along the Sava promenade. According to their official reconstruction, at around 1:43 AM, Matej came running out of the Gothic in only his t-shirt. He was then filmed running upstream along the Sava in Karađorđeva Street near the Branko Bridge, which is at the corner of that street and Crna Gorska. He was filmed trying to flag down a taxi. The taxi did not stop for him, and Matej just kept running onwards in the direction of Braća Krismanović Street. At around 1:52 AM, a camera at the Sava Nova restaurant on the Sava promenade, which is near the Belgrade waterfront development, recorded a young man matching Matej's appearance descending the stairs that led toward the river. This camera footage marks the last known sighting of Matej, and the entire flight from leaving the club to reaching the river had taken him only around 9 minutes. Throughout this entire run, there is no footage anywhere of anyone visibly chasing him. At around 4:15 AM, the last signal from Matej's mobile phone was registered by the base stations around here, which is the place where the Sava flows into the Danube. This was roughly 1.5 kilometers downstream from the Savanova staircase. The police interpreted this signal as being consistent with the phone and presumably the body being carried along by the river current. Something that came out later was that earlier in the evening, at around 10:39 PM, Matej had attempted to call a woman named Maja Sopta. Maja was 31 years old and also from Split, who happened to also be in Belgrade visiting her own friends at the time. She stated that she didn't see the call or the accompanying Instagram message until much later, and she has repeatedly maintained that they did not meet up that night. She would later voluntarily take a polygraph test, which she passed. She has said that her biggest regret was not having answered Matej's call, because she could have at least told him where she was. To clarify the connection between them, Maya's mother had taught Matej at school, and her brother was a friend of his. Now, back at the club, his friends apparently realised that he was gone after about half an hour. They searched around the club and then decided to leave to look for him back at the Dorchel apartment. They had noticed that his jacket was still in the cloakroom, but at that point, they seemed to have just assumed that perhaps he had gone home with someone else for the night. This is the part of the story that has drawn a lot of criticism. The friends would end up waiting roughly 16 hours before contacting any authorities about Matej being missing. It wasn't until around 6 p.m. on the 31st of December that the disappearance was formally reported to the Serbian Ministry of the Interior in Belgrade. By this point, any real window for catching him while there was still a chance had likely long passed. Investigators from both Croatia and Serbia would later sharply criticise the Friends for that delay. The general point being that those first hours are critically important in any case like this. Nenad, Matej's father, arrived in Belgrade in early January 2022 and would remain there for roughly 2 months, leading the family's effort and cooperating with the Serbian police throughout. What followed was a massive search operation. Multiple Serbian Interior Ministry units were mobilised, including river police, divers and search teams from across the city. River police boats began patrolling the Sava in front of the Gotic and the Bate and Hala area. By the 3rd of January, even the Serbian president, Aleksandar Vučić, had publicly stated that authorities were doing everything in their power and that they had already had an assessment of what had happened. A captain of the Coast Guard Association noted at the time that the Sava current was running at roughly 10 kilometers an hour and warned that in water that was sitting at around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, a body neither sinks nor surfaces, but tends to drift between the layers. It's just an important piece of information for understanding why the search was so difficult, as it means that in those conditions, a body just wouldn't have been visible for long periods from the surface of the water. Within the first week or so of the investigation, Serbian police had also reportedly found traces of substances both in the rented apartment in Dorćol and in the rental van that the group had driven to Belgrade. By this point, multiple different CCTV videos were already circulating in the Serbian press. There was footage of him running, of him trying to stop the taxi, and there was also an unverified clip of someone allegedly swimming in the Sava that was being passed around. Nenad confirmed that the taxi clip did show his son, but he rejected the swimming clip outright, pointing out that nobody could swim in 4 degrees Celsius water, even in a diving suit. In mid-January, a Croatian Interior Ministry delegation, led by the Criminal Police Director Antonio Gerovac, travelled to Belgrade for joint talks with the Serbian Interior Minister Aleksandar Vulin. Gerovac told reporters at the time that there were no indications of foul play, that lie detector tests of Matej's friends did not indicate any involvement on their part, and that drones and thermal cameras were now also being used in the search. The search was also extended downstream into neighbouring countries because of the assumption that if Matej had entered the water, the Sava-Danube current would carry the body eastward over time. A Serbian search department official named Miloš Stanimirović said by late January that they were receiving around a dozen reports a day of alleged sightings of Matej, all of which had to be checked. Volunteer Facebook search groups were popping up everywhere, and Matej's father was still in Belgrade, giving regular interviews to the press. By the end of February of 2022, Nenad finally returned to Split, telling Croatian outlets that he just couldn't bear the daily uncertainty any longer, though he made it clear that he would return. In early March, a male body was pulled from the Danube after being spotted by a fisherman. This was near Kostolac, which is downstream from Belgrade. The body was in advanced decomposition, and for several days it was feared to be Matej, but the autopsy ultimately excluded him. After this, the searches continued but with reduced intensity. By this point, the Belgrade prosecutors and police had settled on the working hypothesis that Matej had entered the Sava near the Sanova promenade and had been carried away by the current. The case was being treated as a missing person and likely accidental rather than anything to do with foul play. And just to be clear, as far as I can ascertain, that body that was pulled out I don't think was ever identified. Then, on Wednesday, the 18th of May 2022, which was 139 days after Matej went missing, the crew of a Danube cargo vessel spotted a male body floating downstream, near Adahuja, a peninsula in northeastern Belgrade, well downstream from where Matej was believed to have entered the Sava. The captain, Miloš Zanelović, said that the remains looked like they had been in the water for a long time, and he suggested that a strong wind that morning may have dislodged them from wherever they had been wedged for the previous months. The police pulled the body from the river shortly after. The man was dressed in jeans, a t-shirt with a printed inscription, and a single white sneaker, all of which match what Matej had been wearing. Forensic experts attended the scene, and the higher public prosecutor's office ordered both an autopsy and a DNA analysis. The following day, on the 19th of May, the Croatian Prime Minister publicly announced at a government meeting that the DNA testing had confirmed that the body was indeed Matej. He extended condolences to the family and thanked the Serbian police. The preliminary autopsy concluded that he did indeed pass away in the river, and importantly, there were no injuries to indicate anything else. On the 20th of May, a farewell mass was held for Matej, which was widely commented on in the regional media. Nenad told the congregation, "I thank Belgrade for its great heart, regardless of the fact that my son's life ended there. It has come to an end. I am going home with my son." He went on to thank the Serbian and Croatian interior ministries and the journalists that had covered the case to keep it in the spotlight. Not long after, the Belgrade Higher Public Prosecutor's Office formally announced that there were no grounds to suspect that Matej's passing was the result of foul play. Toxicology analysis detected toxic concentrations of substances in him and also showing up on hair samples. This led prosecutors to conclude that the passing was accidental, possibly preceded by a stimulant-induced state of disorientation that would explain his sudden flight from the club, his disregard for the traffic that he ran through, and his eventual descent into the river. That is the official conclusion to the case. What makes this case stand out to me is that we actually have an answer, which is something that we don't seem to get very often with cases like this. A number of people I've covered on the channel before, Mattias Borg, Odin Jakobsson, Rory Johnson Hatfield, among others too, all disappeared in strikingly similar circumstances, and none of them were ever found. No toxicology or analysis or CCTV reconstruction that would demonstrate conclusively what happened. So in each of those cases, we're really left guessing at the mechanism behind what happened. Matej's case is different because we do have all of that. The broad shape of what happened to him is at least visible to us. A heavy night, a sudden disoriented flight from the club, a run through freezing streets towards the river, and then we know what happened after that. Now, that obviously doesn't prove that the same thing happened to Mattias or Odin or Rory or others. We can't say that they had anything in their systems because nobody ever found out one way or the other. But the pattern is striking enough that I think it's worth holding Matej's case up alongside theirs, and at least wondering whether some of what we see here could quietly be at play in those two. The only thing that Matej's case can't tell us, though, is the thing we'd most want to know really. What specifically triggered him to run in the first place? The combination of drink and substances does most of the explanatory work for the behaviour that we do see on the CCTV. That kind of disoriented sprint, the disregard for traffic, the fact that he didn't grab his jacket on the way out, all of that is broadly consistent with a stimulant-driven panic or a bad reaction of some kind. So we have a reasonable idea of why he was behaving that way once he left the booth. What we don't have any window into is the moment that flipped the switch, and that's because the cameras inside the Gothic were not working on that night. If something did happen inside to trigger him into a panic in the first place, and then to suddenly bolt is just not knowable. It could have been a bad reaction to what was in his system, a paranoid thought, an argument with someone, a hallucination, or none of those things. There's just no way to know since the cameras weren't working inside. Nenad himself, after the toxicology reports were eventually released, did not really dispute them. He has said publicly, "I'm sorry that the cameras didn't work, and Matej took his secret to the grave. I don't know what happened in Gothic. I don't know why he took substances, why he went out and ran. I think it was an accident." He went on to say that he trusts the prosecution. Some of the papers that I came across seem to portray the family as completely rejecting the prosecutor's conclusion, though it seems that the reality is more nuanced than that. A question that did come up a lot in the early coverage was whether someone could have put something in his drink without him knowing, which would obviously explain the substances being in his system without him having voluntarily taken them. Some friends initially suggested in the Croatian media that he was hallucinating shortly before he left, which is what fed into that line of thinking. The complicating factor though is that the police did find substances in the rented apartment and in the van that the group had been using before they ever set foot in Gothic. Another point of criticism throughout has been the friends themselves, specifically the 16-hour delay in reporting him missing, which as mentioned earlier, retired investigators from both Croatia and Serbia have publicly expressed frustration about. They were ultimately cleared by the authorities and returned to Croatia by Monday, the 3rd of January 2022. Realistically, it just seems to have been a case of a group of young men who'd been drinking heavily, who initially assumed Matej had wandered off with someone else for the night, and who underestimated how serious things had become by the time they realised that he was actually gone. That isn't great, especially given what those hours might have meant for the search effort, but it's not particularly suspicious either. The major criticism, it seems, is the 16-hour delay itself. Early on, there were also some suggestions in the press that the disappearance might have been the result of some kind of hate-based conflict between a Croatian visitor and somebody in Serbia. That idea was explicitly denied by Minister Vulin, who called Belgrade a safe city and praised Nenad's restraint in not feeding into that kind of narrative. To his credit, Nenad has been consistently gracious about the people of Belgrade and the Serbian authorities throughout the whole ordeal. On the other side of the coin though, the Belgrade tabloid coverage of the case became a controversy in its own right. The Serbian Press Council and Journalists Association issued formal statements condemning the way several Belgrade tabloids covered the case, particularly for publishing certain images of the body before they had even been identified, and for naming it as Matej before any DNA confirmation. Unfortunately, tabloids being tabloids, here we are. So, where does that leave us? The official explanation does account for most of what we can see. The substances disoriented him, he ran out of the club, and then he ended up in the Sava, through complete loss of awareness, where he then passed away in the water. The body washing up in the Danube months later fits that timeline cleanly. The part nobody will ever really know is what actually happened inside the club itself, because there's no footage of it. That seems to be the only potential gap in the story, but it's not the kind of gap that necessarily requires foul play to fill it. With that about brings us to the end of this. I'd just like to take the time to thank you for watching, and a big thank you to the patrons who've been running around on the screen. If you found this video interesting, then please do remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you didn't like it, then feel free to give me a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys, look after each other, and peace.